And so my third video on Stalin's terror. And this video is going to focus on the how. The use of trials, the use of confessions, the use of imprisonment, the gulag, and executions. With, I hope, a bit of detail that you will find useful for your studies. So how did Stalin conduct terror on his own people? I'm going to begin with a timeline, but I'm not going to go through the detail of what happened. Instead, I'm going to pick out some important points. I'm going to begin with the Shakti show trial that put on trial engineers accused of sabotage in the Shakti coal mine, because Stalin used the trial, claimed that the trial exposed the counter-revolution of the bourgeoisie, and thousands of the old intelligentsia, the bourgeois experts in industry or the bureaucracy, would now be purged. And so the Ryutin affair and Kirov's murder and the show trials that followed. It's uncertain whether Stalin was behind Kirov's murder, but what we do know is that Stalin acted immediately. Within 2 hours of the murder, he instigated a decree against terrorist acts, which gave sweeping powers to arrest, try, and execute those responsible. Investigations were not to last more than 10 days. Military courts would be used, the cases heard in absentia. No appeals were to be allowed. Indeed, death sentences would be carried out immediately. Stalin's rivals at the top of the party were the overt targets, with Trotsky being demonized in the process. But party members associated with those tried were also arrested. Tens of thousands of others were sent into internal exile, and purges of party members led to around 1.5 million expulsions from the party. A purge of the wider party leadership followed. Its scale was revealed after Stalin's death in Nikita Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Congress in 1956. Khrushchev's secret speech. This is a part of what he said. Of the 139 members and candidates of the party's Central Committee who were elected at the 17th Party Congress, 98 people, in other words 70%, were arrested and shot. The same fate met not only the Central Committee members, but also the majority of the delegates to the 17th Party Congress. Of 1,966 delegates with either voting or advisory rights, 1,108 were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary crimes. In other words, decidedly more than half. For good measure, Stalin also closed down both the Society of Old Bolsheviks and the Society of Political Prisoners of the Tsarist regime. Lenin's most devoted disciple didn't want other disciples getting together. And so I moved to the purge of the military in 1937. Stalin began by transferring large numbers of higher-ranking officers so as to ensure centres of opposition weren't formed when the purge came. It came in May when it was claimed that a gigantic conspiracy had been uncovered, with Marshal Tukhachevsky, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Deputy Commissar for Defence, Marshal Egorov, Chief of the General Staff, and 6 other generals, all of them heroes of the Civil War, at the centre of it. They were charged with treason, accused of spying for Germany and Japan. Some of the evidence was supplied on request by German intelligence. Well, it was in their interests. In June, they were put on trial, a one-day tribunal. They were found guilty and shot early the following morning. Both speed and secrecy were important in order to prevent a military reaction, even a coup. Besides, the torture of the senior commanders had exacted further confessions. In a little over a week, a further 980 senior officers and political commissars were arrested in connection with the conspiracy. Over the next 18 months, all three branches of the armed forces were ruthlessly purged. When it had finished, all 11 war commissars were dismissed. 3 of the 5 army's marshals also dismissed. 14 out of 16 of its commanders and more than 2/3 of the 280 divisional commanders and half of the commissioned officer corps, 35,000 in total, as well as more than 60% of the political commissars, all purged. And of these, 7,000 were arrested and either imprisoned or shot. And 75 of the 80-man strong Supreme Military Council were also executed. All of the commander of the Navy and all serving admirals of the fleet were shot, and thousands of naval officers sent to labour camps. The Soviet Air Force was dealt with in the same manner. Only one senior commander surviving the purge. Not even the military intelligence service was spared. And as had become the norm, their wives and children were often arrested and killed. And so, the Great Terror, stretching from 36 into 1939, but peaking in the years 37 and 38. The number of denunciations, expulsions, trials, imprisonments and executions multiplied in the Great Terror. Regional show trials copied those in Moscow and Leningrad. Around 40 in the second half of 1937 and another 30 in 1938. The need for witnesses to whatever trumped-up charges were made only served to provide opportunities for those seeking advancement or revenge. Initially, only leading members of the party had been targeted, but by mid-1937 the net had widened to include large numbers of administrators and specialists, both the old bourgeois experts and the new red experts. Party members were still very much a target. Important officials were arrested and shot. All the Leningrad Central Committee were removed, and almost the entire party structure from top to bottom in the Ukraine were purged. In Georgia, Stalin's home state, 2 state prime ministers were removed and 4/5 of the regional party secretaries, as well as 2/3 of the delegates who had attended the 10th Georgian Party Congress, and thousands of party officials, all purged. In both Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, the entire party bureaus were arrested. In most of the other republics, high-ranking official officers were purged, establishing a mood of terror and ensuring the regions were brought under Stalin's control. Lastly, even the ordinary people started to be purged. Denunciations, expulsions, trials, imprisonments and executions multiplied rapidly. So many that special 3-man courts, troika, were set up to try the victims. The internal passports that had been introduced at the end of 1932 and given to those living in cities in order to stem the flow into the cities from the countryside now proved useful in identifying the former people. Former whites, nobles, merchants, Tsarist bureaucrats, Tsarist policemen, members of anti-Bolshevik parties, or kulaks and their relatives. Stalin called for vigilance, claiming these former people had wormed, and I quote Stalin, their way into our plants and factories, into our government offices and trading organisations, into our railway and water transport enterprises, and principally into the collective farms and state farms. They have crept into these places and taken cover there, donning the mask of workers and peasants, and some of them have even managed to worm their way into the party. A strong and powerful dictatorship of the proletariat. That is what is now needed. Some troikas didn't even have time to read the files, to appear before the troika, even if virtually, was enough to be found guilty. And so, to the show trials. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail here. I want to focus on some important aspects to this. A few words first on the all-important apparatus of the terror, the Cheka. It was set up under Lenin and had become a virtual law unto itself during the Civil War, when it was thought to have been responsible for some 250,000 executions, 250,000 executions. After the Civil War, it became known as the GPU, the State Political Administration, and then with the creation of the Soviet Union, it became known as the All-Union GPU, or OGPU. It was made responsible to the Commissar for Justice. Trials would be conducted with the most serious cases going before the senior military court, the military collegium. But with the increased numbers appearing before the courts during the drive for collectivization, our three-man courts, the Troika, were set up. The law that all this apparatus was to apply was Article 58 of the Russian Criminal Code that covered an extensive range of counter-revolutionary and terrorist crimes, doing so deliberately with an imprecision that allowed anybody to be caught in its net for doing just about anything. This was even more the case after Kirov's murder, when Stalin issued his decree against terrorist acts. Torture was not officially sanctioned, except at the height of the terror in 1937-38, when at some point, the document has never been found, torture was indeed sanctioned. But all the time, sleep deprivation, being forced to stand for hours on end, as well as other cruelties, amounted to torture. In July 1937, NKVD orders 00446 and 00447 called for, quote, an end once and for all to the foul, subversive work against the foundations of the Soviet state. The NKVD had the power to do as it wished. There wouldn't be trials as we understand them. Instead, prisoners would be presented with the charges and required to accept their guilt. But whether they did or not, they would be found guilty and sentence would be passed. NKVD interrogations were based on the conveyor system of sleep deprivation, continued questioning and beatings, and they resulted in confessions. Confessions legitimized the whole process, including the guilty verdict and the sentencing. Besides, the confessions would then be used to implicate others. No documentary or material evidence was produced at any of the trials. The cases against those accused were based entirely on their confessions and the witness statements of others. But these were in the main hardened and committed revolutionaries. Certainly those in the show trials and those targeted in the upper echelons of the party. So how did they come to confess crimes for which they knew they were not guilty? We've noted that they were indeed tortured, and we've noted the conveyor system of sleep deprivation, the continuing questioning, and this questioning by relays of interrogators and the beatings. They were left cold and hungry in the time in between the sessions, and each victim was forced to name others, thus providing evidence for their guilt and to justify the investigation, while at the same time weakening the resolve of the accused. A confession, it was thought, would save loved ones from imprisonment or internal exile, or perhaps even the same fate as themselves. Promises of pardons and a return to the party were also given, but not honoured. But added to this, we also have to understand that most of those accused remained utterly loyal to the party and to the revolution. And so the party had to be seen to be right, and their duty was to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, the revolution. Not to do so would render all previous sacrifices a waste of time, not to mention their own assertion of the party's power in times past. Consider how Kamenev and Zinoviev each approached the party after their expulsion in 1927. Kamenev offered a full and complete surrender to the party because nothing could be done outside and despite the party. That's what Kamenev himself said, while Zinoviev humbled himself, saying, "I ask you to restore me to the ranks of the party and give me an opportunity of working with the common cause." And as for the use of show trials, Leo Kopelev, a committed communist but a critic of the regime's tactics with regard to dekulakization and collectivization, and ultimately a dissident, later wrote an autobiography. It was called To Be Preserved Forever. And he said this of the show trials: "I regard the purge trials of 1937 and 38 as an expression of some far-sighted policy. I believed that on balance Stalin was right in deciding on these terrible measures in order to discredit all forms of political opposition. Once and for all, we were a besieged fortress. We had to be united, knowing neither vacillation nor doubt. But to most people, the broad masses, the theoretical differences between left and right within the party were difficult to understand. Both sides quoted Lenin and swore loyalty to the October Revolution. Therefore, the opposition leaders had to be depicted as deviationists and villains, so that the people would come to hate them." So, the trials. Dealing with the military. Now, we've looked at the purge of the military, and we've seen that the result of exacting confessions as a result of torture is that the victims will say anything to have the torture end. Consequently, it wasn't long before evidence of an army plot was brought to Stalin. Further investigations led to German counterintelligence, which I've mentioned, making their helpful intervention, and suspicion now fell on officers who had formed links with German officers as a result of the Treaty of Berlin back in 1926. This led to the arrest of Chukovetsky and 7 of the senior commanders. Chukovetsky had the further incriminating factor that he had been a protege of Trotsky. And so the Great Terror. We've already noted the extent to which members of the Central Committee, as well as the delegates at the 17th Party Congress, were targeted. Leaders in the party or in other prominent positions in the economy or the arts, for example, were put on lists that were submitted to Stalin and other members of the Politburo. Stalin personally signed off on 362 different lists. In total, there were 44,000 names on these lists. And of that number, 39,000 were condemned to death. But the purges were widened even further, so that anyone could be dragged into the net. Such was the scale of things that Moscow began to set the region's quotas of how many people needed to be purged, the numbers to be executed, those to be sent to the labour camps and those to be exiled. And it was this that set the local officials in different regions to compete with each other. NKVD squads went into localities as hundreds were executed at a time, their bodies dumped into mass graves, some containing more than 20,000 bodies. The Gulag camps had their own quotas too, and these, of course, would only result in death sentences. Many victims ended up in the Gulags, others were simply executed straight away. Life in the Gulags was extremely harsh. Prisoners began their life in the camps doing hard labour. As they proved themselves useful, their condition could improve, though you and I would never want to experience them. We should be more surprised at the number of people who survived the camps than the number who died miserable deaths. One estimate put the life expectancy in the worst of the camps at just 1 year. It's impossible to say with any confidence just how many were dragged into the net of terror. The numbers vary widely, but even at the lower end, they are quite staggering. For if one person was implicated, then their extended family could be implicated too, for they could be tainted. Robert Galately, in his book, gives the example of Anton Antonov of Zhenyenko, if I get anywhere near to that, whose father Vladimir had stormed the Winter Palace in 1917 and was a Red Army commander in the Civil War before becoming an ambassador for 12 years, only to fall foul of the purges when he was recalled in 1937. He was arrested and executed. His son was 17 at the time, a loyal supporter of the regime, as of course his father was, and a member of Komsomol. He was arrested in 1940, released but arrested again when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. He endured 12 years in the Gulag system for being the son of a loyal communist who had been purged. How many went to the gulags, the labour camps in the period from the 17th Party Congress at the beginning of 34 to the end of the Great Purge in 39? Estimates are just that. They are estimates. We don't really know for sure, but I will give you some figures in the a video that deals with the effects of the terror. I would close this video by pointing to 4 key characteristics that made the Great Terror different to anything that had gone before. First, its scale. Much, much greater than anything that had gone before. Secondly, it was, and I'm talking about the Great Terror now, it was less anti-Trotskyist and actually more fearful of the right wing. Thirdly, even if Stalin instigated it, what control existed was in the hands of the NKVD and in the hands of local branches. Which brings me to the 4th point. Central control was clearly lost, and local initiatives, many of which had little ideological foundation, took over.